The Taklamakan, the Sea of Death, had long ago swallowed the ghosts of the Silk Road, burying their empires under a relentless, shifting ocean of sand. Silas and Jada were the latest, faintest ripples on that ancient, unforgiving surface. For 7 days they had walked, their shadows shortening in the brutal sun, lengthening into grotesque things at twilight. Their supplies were gone, their hope was thin, and the only certainty they carried was the weight of the last canteen. It was a dented copper vessel, an antique perhaps 2 centuries old, a relic of better times. Now, it held the equivalent of 1 man's lifeline, or 2 men's slow death. Silas dragged his feet, the coarse sand grating against the leather of his boots. He glanced back at Jada, his mentor, who walked with a disciplined, rhythmic pace, never faltering, never looking down. Jada, a man whose skin was cured leather and whose eyes held the endless expanse of the desert, spoke without opening his lips wide. Focus on the next breath, Silas. The next step is a luxury. Silas knew the wisdom of the desert demanded such rigor, but his body screamed for water, for the cessation of the agonizing, dry-mouthed thirst. Their current heading was based on a faded celestial map and a myth of the Iron Oasis, a place supposedly fed by a deep, undiscovered geothermal spring. The title of their journey, The Final Canteen of the Silk Road, had begun to feel less like a dramatic phrase and more like an impending epitaph. They were far off the main trade routes, navigating a forgotten tributary known only for its dangerous, towering dunes and whispering, hallucinogenic heat. By mid-morning, the air shimmered, turning the horizon into a confusing, fluid surface. Silas saw shapes that were not their city, a lake, a procession of camels. Jada slapped the copper canteen lightly against his thigh, the sound a soft, mocking chime. The desert sells illusions, Silas. Don't buy them. Silas wanted to lash out, to demand the water, but the unspoken agreement held them both. The water was Jada's to distribute, when and if they could both survive the rationing. The ration had been 2 swallows each, once in the morning, once at sunset. They had been skipping the sunset ration for 2 days now. The last swallow Silas had was hours ago. It felt like a vague, distant dream, a memory of moisture that had only intensified his present suffering. He looked up. The sky was a pale, blinding white, the sun a merciless, golden tyrant that offered no shade, no forgiveness. Their feet crushed the small, delicate skeletons of desert Beetlesteiny casualties of this indifferent world. We should rest, Silas croaked, his voice brittle. The midday sun will kill us. Jada didn't slow. The rest will cost us 2 miles of progress. 2 miles is the difference between life and the scavengers. The scavengers. The desert dogs that followed the tracks of the dying creatures that could smell despair on the wind. That thought was enough to pull Silas forward. He tried to think about the Iron Oasis, to focus on the impossible green of its rumored palm trees. It was the only way to keep the despair at bay. He remembered Jada's lesson. In the desert, your body is clay, but your will is iron. He felt like rusting clay. The sand began to change. It darkened to a reddish hue and became packed and stony, indicating they were traversing an old riverbed. Good, Jada whispered, pointing to the ground. The tracks are firmer here. The wind hasn't covered them. Silas saw the faint overlapping tracks of others who had passed this way. Perhaps decades ago their hopes long evaporated. He followed Jada into the shadow of a colossal fossilized dune, seeking respite. It was only half a degree cooler, but the relief was immense. They sat in silence, sharing a few flakes of dried jerky. The food was pointless without water, an insult to their dry throats. Silas watched Jada pull out the copper canteen. Jada's hand trembled slightly, a sign of his own physical deterioration that he could not hide. Jada unscrewed the cap. Metallic scent of water, however faint, hit Silas like a physical blow, stirring a primal, dangerous hunger. Jada tilted the canteen, and 2 measured drops fell onto Silas's tongue. It was shockingly cold, a brief, luxurious flood of life. Thank you, Silas managed, feeling the familiar, immediate surge of energy, knowing it would be fleeting. Jada gave himself the same ration, 2 drops. Then he secured the cap tightly, placing the canteen back in his satchel with the care of handling spun glass. The sheer discipline of the man was both inspiring and terrifying. Silas wondered if Jada valued the rule of rationing more than life itself. They continued on. The old riverbed led them to a stretch of cracked earth, a flat, hard plain that promised speed but offered no cover. This area was treacherous. Sandstorms often materialized without warning, sweeping across the plain like vengeful gods. The wind was picking up now, hot and dry, carrying stinging particles of fine dust that coated Silas's lips and eyelids. They saw something ahead, a ruin, larger than most, the remains of an old watchtower, half submerged in the sand. "Cover," Jada said simply, increasing his pace. They scrambled toward the ruin, their hearts pounding not from exertion but from the sudden, stark fear of the impending storm. They reached the base of the tower just as the sky began to turn an unnatural, ominous yellow-brown. The air was thick, heavy with the coming chaos. They squeezed into a small crevice in the tower's stone foundation, protected from the worst of the wind. The sound of the storm was a screaming roar, deafening and vast. Inside the ruin, Silas spotted something unexpected. A glint of metal half buried beneath a pile of rubble. He clawed the sand away, his fingers raw and bleeding. It was a sealed, military-grade canister, perfectly preserved. He looked at Jada, his eyes wide with frantic hope. Jada, equally aware of the discovery, nodded cautiously. Together, they pried the canister open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of old currency, a journal, and another canteen. This one was aluminum, modern, and heavier than the copper one. Silas shook it gently. Shh. The sound of sloshing water was the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was full canteen of water, a miracle in the heart of the sea of death. Silas immediately reached for it, his survival instinct overwhelming all discipline. He raised the canteen to his lips. "Wait," Jada commanded, his voice sharp and suddenly hard. Silas froze, the cold metal pressed against his mouth. He looked at Jada, the desperation in his eyes bordering on madness. "We are still one day from the oasis," Jada stated, his eyes steady. "If you drink all of that now, you will ruin our current system. You will only increase your thirst later. But it's extra," Phyllis cried, unable to keep the whine of hysteria from his voice. "We can both drink. We can save the copper one." "No," Jada said, gently but firmly taking the aluminum canteen. "We integrate it. It is insurance, not a feast. We save it for the absolute end." Silas felt a deep, boiling rage. He was ready to fight, to wrestle the life-giving water from his mentor, to break the bonds of their long companionship. Jada, sensing the betrayal in his young companion's gaze, held the canteen away. In the desert, Silas, discipline is the only true source of water. The storm outside intensified, throwing sand against the rocks with the force of small bullets. The decision was postponed by the howling wind. Silas slumped back, defeated, his mind now working on a dangerous, insidious thought. "Jada is protecting the water from me, not for me." When the storm finally subsided hours later, the world was blanketed in a fine layer of ochre dust. The watchtower was a temporary island in a freshly sculpted sea. The tracks of the lost had been completely wiped away. They were truly alone now, with no evidence that anyone had ever passed this way before. Jada strapped the new aluminum canteen to his other side. 2 full vessels of water now, secured to the mentor. This sight, the double source of life entirely in Jada's possession, fueled Silas's resentment. He felt the cold touch of paranoia. They walked again. The air was clearer now, but the heat returned with renewed, crushing intensity. Silas felt his mouth drying up faster, an effect he knew of the desperate thirst he felt while knowing the water was close. He stumbled, catching himself on Jada's shoulder. Jada steadied him without a word, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Silas's vision flickered. He saw the shimmering heat rising from the sand, and this time the hallucinations were worse. He saw his own funeral, conducted by the desert winds, the ancient copper canteen placed on his chest like a final medal. He needed water now, not 2 drops, but a flood. His body was failing, and Jada was holding onto the key. "Jada," Silas whispered, his throat seizing up. "My vision is blurring. I need more than the ration." Jada paused, turning his head slowly. He looked Silas over, his eyes clinical, assessing the truth of the distress. He reached for the copper canteen. He twisted the cap and held it out, not for Silas, but for himself. He gave himself 2 drops. Then he recapped it. When you break Silas, you do not just die, you kill us both. Silas watched in horrified disbelief. The act was not cruel. It was an act of brutal, essential discipline, a commitment to a system that he could no longer bear. That night, under a sky impossibly vast and glittering with stars, Silas made a decision. Survival demanded betrayal. He waited until Jada's breathing settled into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. The air was cold, the silence immense. Silas slowly, agonizingly rolled onto his stomach, crawling toward Jada's satchel where the 2 canteens rested. His fingers, numb and clumsy, reached the leather strap, carefully unbuckled the satchel, his ears straining for any change in Jada's breathing. He pulled out the 2 canteens, the small, life-saving copper relic and the full, heavy, modern aluminum one. The temptation was overwhelming, to take the full canteen and run, to leave Jada to his disciplined, silent death and claim life for himself. He hesitated. Jada had brought him this far. Jada had taught him how to walk, how to read the stars, how to survive. But Jada was now a threaded custodian of resources, too rigid to bend the rules even for the sake of 2 lives. Silas unscrewed the aluminum cap. He raised it to his lips, ready to drink, to gorge, to let the water wash away his guilt. Before the first drop touched his tongue, Jada's voice cut through the silence, calm, steady, and terrifyingly awake. The aluminum canteen, Jada said, without moving, holds the water you need. It is yours. Silas froze, the canteen heavy in his hands. He stared at Jada's sleeping form. Jada slowly sat up, revealing the truth. He had been awake the entire time, waiting for Silas's inevitable failure of faith. I knew you would choose the full one, Jada continued, his voice softer now. It is the natural, human, panicked choice. Jada reached into the satchel and pulled out the copper canteen. He offered it to Silas. Take the copper one. Drink from it. Drink until you are satisfied. Silas looked from the copper canteen to the aluminum one in his hand, confused, his mind racing to understand the moral trap. Jada smiled faintly, a thin, dry parting of his cracked lips. I filled the copper canteen with sand, pure, fine, empty sand. Silas looked at the heavy aluminum canteen in his hands, quickly unscrewed the cap and tilted it. Sand poured out, fine, dry, useless sand. The aluminum canteen was a decoy, a test. Jada had kept the last remaining water in the old familiar vessel all along, knowing the weight would protect the secret. Jada had been rationing 3 drops a day for himself, not 2, giving Silas his full allotment and slowly dehydrating himself to preserve the system. Discipline is the only true source of water, Jada repeated, his eyes fading in the starlight. The moment you chose betrayal, you chose sand. Jada handed Silas the copper canteen. Take it. The Iron Oasis is one more sunrise away. You are the only one left to reach it. Silas drank, the sweet, life-saving water flowing over his tongue, now mixed with the bitter taste of shame and respect. He sat with Jada until dawn, watching the sunrise, a new promise in the sky. When the heat hit, Jada was gone, his body already claimed by the desert he mastered. Silas rose, strapping the copper canteen, his final legacy, to his hip. He walked toward the sunrise, a man who had lost his mentor but found his discipline. The journey to the Iron Oasis was his alone now, a lonely final push fueled by the memory of Jada's sacrifice and the weight of the last canteen. The true treasure of the Silk Road was not gold, but the iron will forged in the fires of the Taklamakan, a lesson paid for with the final, precious drops of life. If you felt the heat and the immense weight of Silas's final choice, comment, like, share, and subscribe to Storycraft Studio.